In this section of the tutorial, we'll create two interactive widgets containing animated states. A widget, as I'm defining it here, is a reusable edge animate symbol. First, we'll create the timeline trigger widget and use 8 instances of it placed along the timeline. Then we'll create a detail panel widget that will show the detail text when the timeline trigger is clicked. Start by drawing the ellipse and the text element that define the graphics for the widget. I'm going to select the ellipse tool and zoom in as needed. I'm going to draw a circle approximately 30 pixels by 30 pixels. You can adjust the size here in the properties panel. Set the background color to white. Turn on the border to solid 2 pixels. Select a color for the border. I'm using a dark red color in this case. And then select the text tool and type a text element with a 1 above the ellipse. And I'm going to set the font size to 21 pixels and position the text above the ellipse where it looks like it makes sense. Okay, select the text element and the ellipse and right click on them and choose convert to symbol. And we're going to name the symbol timeline trigger. I'm going to deselect the autoplay timeline option and click OK. Now, the neat thing about working with symbols in Edge Animate is that they have their own timeline and their own editing area. To jump into the timeline of this symbol instance, I'm going to right click on it. Notice that I'm no longer on the stage timeline. I'm inside the timeline trigger timeline on the stage. And notice I have a clean workspace here. I'm going to clean up the naming of the ellipse and the text object. We're going to target this text element with some code in just a little bit, so we need to make sure that the naming is correct and matches what the code will be looking for. So I'm going to start by using labels to divide the timeline into sections. So I'm going to click at the 0 point and add a default label. At the 1 second mark, I'm going to add a rollover label. At the 2 second mark, I'm going to add a rollout label. Let's move to the 1 second mark and let's build our animation span for the rollover state. And I'm going to do that by first selecting the toggle pin button. And I want the new state to end up at the 1.5 second mark. So I'm going to drag the timeline marker to 1.5 seconds. And I'm going to make the ellipse larger and position it so it appears in the center of the symbol space. I'm going to select the text and change it from 21 point to 28 point. And I'll position the text so it looks about right. Now notice that we have animation spans that have appeared across the timeline between the pinned points. And notice that we can see each property animating. Now I'm going to collapse those areas to simplify things and turn off the toggle pin button. And if I want to set the easing for this animation span, I can select the animation across both elements and go into the easing panel. And in this case, I'll choose ease out elastic to give it kind of a fun physics effect. And now you can see that as I animate and pull through, it's going to give a little bounce, a little elasticity. So I'm going to move to the 2 second mark and do basically the same thing. Turn on the toggle pin button. And I'm going to move the time marker to the 2.5 second spot. I'm going to change the size of the ellipse to 30 pixels by 30 pixels and position it back to where it started. I'm going to select the text and change its font size to 21 points and move it so it's centered and looks right like it did when it started. And I'm going to turn off the toggle pin button, and you can see here that I have created essentially my 2 animated states for rollover, rollout. So one last trick I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on the ellipse tool and I'm going to draw a hit area. And this, it doesn't really matter what this looks like because it's going to be invisible, but the concept is that it's an element that sits above everything else and obscures it, and I'm going to capture mouse events off of that element, and that potentially will save some problems with selection. And important to note, I'm going to change the name of this element to hit area. And again, naming is going to be important because I'm going to be using code to target these elements by name. And I'm going to drop the opacity of that hit area down to 0 so it's invisible. It's there, but you can't see it. Okay, so next, what I'm going to do is add some stop actions to this timeline to actually stop the animated states as they play. So for example, when I jump to the rollover label at the 1 second mark and I play through, I want the timeline to stop at the 1.5 second mark. I can do that by moving the marker to the correct time and then clicking on the Insert Trigger button. And in the Actions panel, I'm going to work with the Action Assistant, and I'm going to click Playback, Stop, and I'm going to apply that to the timeline trigger, my current timeline, and I'm going to hit Enter to commit that code. Okay, so you can see here that very simply I use the assistant to guide me through the process of adding the code sim.stop, which will stop the symbol at that point. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the rollout animation section. Click on the timeline trigger, click on the playback option, stop, apply it to the timeline trigger object, and I'll hit enter to commit the code. Now you can see here that the timeline triggers with the actions are placed on the timeline, and I've essentially created the graphic states. Now, before I move on to the stage timeline and create instances of this symbol, I'm going to go up to the Elements panel and click on the Open Actions button and insert a new event, Creation Complete. And in the Creation Complete event, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bit of code that will create the animation effect. So what I'm doing here is I'm targeting the hit area element, that's our naming convention. So I'm looking for that element on the stage. I'm assigning event handlers to it, mouse over, mouse out, and click. Whenever any of those mouse events happen, I'm going to call the handle event function, which I have up here. And the handle event function is going to look at what event is happening and what should happen as a result. If the mouse over event happens, then the symbol will play the rollover state. It will go to the label and play to the stop action. On mouse out, we'll go to the rollout state and play to the stop action at the 2.5 second mark. We'll come back in just a moment and work with the click event, adding a bit more code in the next section. Notice that I'm also creating a variable here called ID. And you'll also notice up at the top here that there's going to be another variable called selected, and that will finish off the mix of how this works. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the stage timeline by clicking on the stage link at the top of the workspace, and I want to create 8 instances of this symbol. So kind of a neat thing is that not only does a symbol have its own timeline, but I can create multiple instances of that symbol and place them wherever I like within my composition. So I'm copying and pasting 8 instances here. And the only other thing I'm going to do visually, just for graphic effect, is stagger those instances. And again, I want to go back to the concept of the naming convention. So the code I'm going to add in the next little snippet is going to target a specific naming convention, which starts with a capital T trigger, followed by a 0 through 7. So I have trigger 0, and I have trigger 1, trigger 2, trigger 3, and so on. Now the thing to be careful here is that it's very easy to have a typo, and if you have a typo in your naming convention, it's not going to work. It's also really easy to fix. You just go back over. If something doesn't work, the first thing you do is go and check your spelling. If something's not spelled right, just clean it up and you're ready to go. So now you can see here that I have my naming convention, trigger 0 through 7. And while I'm on the stage timeline, I'm going to click on the Open Actions button next to the stage element, and I'm going to add just a little bit of code that will initialize those 8 instances. Now, what I've done here is I've created a loop, and I'm looping through 8 times. I'm looking for the naming convention trigger plus a number, starts at 0, goes to 7, for a total of 8 instances. I'm going to set the text element within each symbol to whatever the current loop number is plus 1. So loop starts at 0, so we'll name the first one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then you'll notice here that we're also setting the ID variable that we created in our last step, and we'll set that between 0 and 7. So I'm going to save the file, and if I test in a browser, you can see here that I have animated states as I roll over and roll out, and you can see that the numbers are no longer just the default 1 as it's seen in the symbol, but instead we've set that to numbers 1 through 8. Okay, let's go back and we're going to create one more widget, and this will be the detail panel widget. And I will zoom out so I can see my stage a little better. And I'm going to return to my text project, and copy out some text, which is a year, caption, and details text elements. And I'm going to paste that into my project and position it so it's roughly in the center of the visible space of the background. Now it's simple enough to use the text tool to create these elements, but of course I'm trying to speed us along. Once I've created my text, I'm going to right click and I'm going to convert them to a symbol, and I'm going to name this symbol Detail Panel. And I'm going to uncheck Autoplay Timeline just for good measure and click OK. So what I've done here is I've just grouped that text so it's going to be easier to animate as a single element. And I'm going to right click on that instance and I'm going to convert it into a symbol, therefore nesting it inside of another symbol. And I'm going to name this one Detail Panel Animation. Okay, I'm going to uncheck the Autoplay Timeline and click OK. So I'm going to double click on the instance of the Detail Panel Animation on the stage and enter its timeline. And I'm going to add labels as I did before, and I'll start at 0 and add a default label. I'll move to the 1 second mark. I'm going to add a label named Show. And I'll move to the 2 second mark and I'm going to add a label named Height. And this animation will be very straightforward.